All right, good evening. This is the first podcast for Paul 200 in 2014. And today's podcast is going to address one of the more complex parts of the Republic. It's going to address, as far as I can, the relationship between the image of the Son, the idea of the good, and in particular the image of the divided line. Now, the questions raised in this part of the Republic, they're probably not questions that can be resolved simply by looking at the Republic itself. What we would have to do to fully understand what Plato is trying to say about philosophy and the relationship between really the character of reality and the human soul, to fully unravel that, you'd have to work your way through many of the other dialogues, as I think I've mentioned in lecture. The Republic, as complicated as it is, it's really only one chapter in a book, and the book are the Platonic dialogues as a whole. So we can only reach some partial answers by looking at those sections of the Republic at the end of Book 6 and thinking about that section, the discussion of the Son, the good, and the divided line, in light of what happens in the rest of the Republic. But this, I think, will give us some hints about both what Plato means through these images and the limits of those images themselves. So, let's get started. So, Socrates' discussion of the idea of the good and the divided line is an extension of Socrates' discussions of the forms or ideas. And that's an issue that's addressed at length in Book 6 and at the end of Book 5 as well, though the issue of the forms or the ideas, the question of the forms, is something that's discussed or implied throughout the dialogue as a whole. So the idea of the good, together with the divided line, are meant to articulate together the character of being. In fancy philosophical terms, the good is an ontology, a speech or logos about being, or rather, Socrates' speech about the idea of the good is an attempt to explain the character of being. And the divided line is meant to address the character of human knowing, and human soul's capacity for knowledge. We could call it an epistemology, a speech about knowing or knowledge. Episteme, for the Greek for knowledge, and logos, the Greek for speech or even reason. Okay, so attempts to analyze and explain the character of reality and the way in which the human soul knows reality. We might well wonder, why as students of political science we have to study these things or concern ourselves with these things. But it seems to me that Plato has provided all the reason that we need. The argument of the Republic is that politics depends upon, or at the very least is related to, our views about the ultimate character of reality and our ability to discern or to know that reality. And I think this is probably evident even from the first discussion with Cephalus. Politics, political questions, moral and ethical questions always push beyond simply the realm of the political. To understand politics, you have to situate humanity in our place in the universe. Okay, so fair enough. Questions about justice and morality point towards broader questions about, the role of religion in human affairs, the role of the gods, the ultimate character of reality. Now, what's troubling here, though I think also very interesting, is to my mind the relatively clear suggestion in the Republic that philosophers must teach a partial or approximate doctrine about being. A doctrine that, while not exactly false, is certainly incomplete. One way to see this is that Socrates' understanding of the idea of the good is not the same as Glaucon's. Now, how is this the case? Well, Socrates understands the ideas and the idea of the good as a source of puzzles or problems or mysteries, sources of wonder that motivate philosophical investigation. Glaucon understands the theory of the forms and the idea of the good as if they're objects of knowledge already discerned by the philosopher. So you might say that Glaucon understands philosophy in a dogmatic fashion, as if the lover of wisdom is already wise. Whereas for Socrates, the forms really are an hypothesis, something to be investigated, something to be questioned. So, Socrates introduces the idea of the good in order to answer a question, or Adeimantus' question, about the greatest studies of the Guardian class. And you might recall that the preceding pages up to this point in Book 6 are essentially an irony-laden discussion of the relationship between the educational practices of Book 2 and 3 and philosophical education. The tensions between the two goals of education should be obvious to us by this point, though in case we haven't gotten the message, Socrates will hammer it home further with the image of the cave in Book 8. In other words, hammering home this point that, at the very least, creating a guardian devoted, completely devoted to the city and speech, or really a guardian devoted to any society, is going to be in tension with what's necessary to educate a philosophical soul. So at this point in Book 6, however, Socrates identifies the good as the object of the greatest study. Why might that be the case? Well, the good defines what we want, or what we think we want. We want nothing unless it is good. And unlike the case of justice, we want things that are actually good, not merely the things that appear to be so. The good is what every soul pursues, though typically only dimly knowing what it's pursuing. But what then is the good? Is this something we can have knowledge of? Is the good itself knowledge? Is the good itself pleasure? Is it political wisdom or practical judgment, as the dialogue participants suggest? So, Socrates observes that Adeimantus and Glaucon will not rest easy with the opinions of others on this question. They will only be satisfied with knowledge of the good. They ask Socrates to go through the idea of the good, just as he went through the ideas of justice and moderation. Though, if we think back, we know that those analyses themselves were incomplete and partial. But now, Socrates admits that he cannot satisfy them, at least not completely, though it isn't clear that Glaucon and Adeimantus understand the limits of Socrates' claims. Socrates suggests that philosophers must not only presume that forms exist, thus allowing us to supposedly have knowledge of justice as opposed to just anthropological facts about what some given culture refers to as justice. And I say supposedly here because, and this is a point we'll get back to later, it's not clear that Socrates regards the form of justice, say, as something that they have discerned, but rather he seems to approach it, if we think about the Republic as a whole, he seems to take the supposition about the idea of justice as a starting point, not necessarily a conclusion. At any rate, to investigate the good, you must presume that knowledge of the good is possible. The good, in other words, can't be presumed to simply be a projection of our desires, but is rather a self-subsisting entity that can potentially be perceived through reason. I think this is perhaps just a more complicated way of saying, the good is something that is objective. It is not something that is just purely idiosyncratic, purely rooted in the self, but the good is something that exists outside the self. But more than this, the idea of the good is not meant to merely account for the various good things. It's meant to account for the intelligibility of the forms themselves. So, the discussion of the good takes place, as I said, in the context of the discussion of the proper course of study for philosophers, as well as a discussion of how the city can take up philosophy without being destroyed. According to Socrates, the study of the good, or rather the idea of the good, is the highest or most important type of philosophical inquiry. In a way, knowledge of the good, of course, is something we all desire, whether we're philosophers or not. The problem, of course, is that we rarely stop to consider the good in any comprehensive way. The idea of the good presented by Socrates suggests that there is an entity, the good, capital G good, which unites in some way the meaning of all the various instances of the good. But more than this as well, the idea of the good as presented by Socrates is something like a god. The good is not only the meaning that unifies our use of a particular term, that is an idea, that's a form. It is a thing which in some way is the source of existence itself, or at least the intelligibility of existence. As I said in lecture, we can't speak of the good as the cause of the forms per se, because that would imply that the forms are not eternal. If something's caused, obviously it's not eternal. Yet the good is somehow the source of the intelligibility and stability of the forms. Okay, so you move from what is very close to you, the pursuit of what is good, what we desire, but we hope that those things have some sort of reality to them and not merely apparent goods, not merely idiosyncratic goods. And Socrates is linking up that most you might almost say intimate experience, that most human, most universal experience, with a claim about the nature of reality, that the good is something which is the source of intelligibility. Well, at this point, you might say, along with Glaucon, what a demonic exaggeration. And indeed, the idea of the good is more than a little strange. Later Greek playwrights would mock Plato for the impenetrability of this concept. In the play Amphicrates, for instance, a slave teases his master, who is pursuing a particularly unwholesome young lady. "What good you expect to get from her, sir? I understand less than I do the good of Plato." So, if you're confused at this point, or even just suspicious, note that you're not alone. Let's see how the issue is presented in the Republic, and we'll be able to discern how the demonic excesses identified by Glaucon in a way emerge from ordinary experience, much like the idea of the forms emerge from our use of ordinary language. Socrates suggests that Glaucon should be familiar with the idea of the good. Perhaps Socrates has discussed it before. And he identifies its two major elements. The good names that which we pursue in general, but the good is something we lack sufficient knowledge of. As Socrates puts it, do you suppose it's of any advantage to possess everything except what's good? Or to be prudent about everything else in the absence of the good, while being prudent about nothing fine and good? So the good simply names that which we pursue or desire or genuinely desire. But what is this comprehensive good that we desire? Perhaps in the sense of a good life. What kind of life is good? This is the question that's implicitly raised here. The two main or typical candidates identified here are a life devoted to the good of pleasure and prudence, which, as I've mentioned in class, can also be translated as political judgment. Both have their difficulties. Prudence, which is a translation of the Greek word phronesis, is a virtue of the rational part of the mind, but the use of this virtue depends upon some broader end. Your practical judgment on how best to connect means and ends is only good if the ends you pursue are in fact good. So could pleasure be such an end? Socrates claims that all of those who define pleasure as the good are full of confusion, because all will admit, or more precisely, all are compelled to admit, that there are bad pleasures. So you'll have to think about that claim for yourself. It seems as if it's not quite as easy to refute the equation of pleasure and the good as it was to at least see the problems with the connection between phronesis and the good. We might separate good and bad pleasures on the grounds that some pleasures, while maybe good in themselves in some way, are obstacles to some higher good. So, it wouldn't be contradictory to assert that some pleasures are both good and bad at the same time, which Adeimantus accepts, and you can think of your own examples, because a pleasure can easily be seen as good in one way, yet bad in another. Nevertheless, it is certainly true that there are a great many disputes about the meaning of the good. So this is what we know. The good is that which we pursue or desire, and it is at the same time subject to many doubts and controversies. Socrates attempts to show how the good differs from justice. While the value of justice is in doubt, in the simple sense that we might well think that there can be advantages from maintaining the appearance of justice while committing injustice. Quote, when it comes to good things, no one is satisfied with what is opined to be so, but each seeks the things that are. And from here on out, everyone despises opinion. So this is another one of Socrates' curious questions. Adeimantus assents far too easily to the question. After all, is it really the case that all individuals seek the truth about the good? Is it not more likely, or just as likely, that individuals are quite content to accept notions of the good that have been implanted in their minds since childhood? At any rate, Socrates' next claim is certainly correct and not really admitting of many doubts or contradictory versions. The just and fair things will never find any adequate guardian unless the goodness of justness and fairness is known. All right, so what then is this good? How can we evaluate the goodness of justice and thus its desirability? Now here things get interesting. Socrates admits that he cannot give a full account of the good, but he will instead present a kind of image or child of the good, something that will allow sub-philosophical souls, I suppose, to understand and appreciate his meaning. Though I think we go further and say it's not just the case that Socrates is dumbing it down for Glaucon and Adeimantus. He doesn't fully understand this idea of the good. So, we admit to the existence of many good things and many fair or beautiful things. And here we are, we're at 507 AB for those who are following along in the text. So, going further, Socrates asserts that our use of general terms, such as beautiful or good, points to the existence of one idea of each thing. We might say that's what's implied. We might say that it's, as I think used this term before in lecture, it's an hypothesis that's embedded in language. So the beautiful things are seen, but the idea of the beautiful, which is what allows us to see a thing as beautiful, is not itself seen. At this point, Socrates compares the sight and intellection, which will ultimately lead us to his presentation of the sun as an image of the good. The power of sight to reveal any object depends upon light. Light is the medium through which we perceive the objects in the world. This much is obvious. What isn't obvious is that according to Socrates, the good is similar to the sun in the realm of ideas. It is the source of intelligibility in the world, the source of what we might call intellectual illumination. Socrates goes further in the comparison. Just as the sun provides not only a medium for sight, but provides as well a source of warmth and growth, so too does the idea of the good provide more than a medium for intellection. Existence and being itself are the result of the good. To quote Glaucon again, by Apollo, what a demonic excess. So, the good is like the sun. The sun is both a source of physical life and illumination, while the good is the source of the intelligibility of the world, and in some ways, some underspecified way we might say, it is the source of the being of the world itself. Socrates continues with his description of the greatest study by introducing the image of the divided line, which is an attempt to explain the various ways in which we perceive the visible and intelligible world. So what's the significance of this transition from Socrates addressing the idea of the good to a discussion of the various ways in which the soul can apprehend the world? Well, I think the implication is that this too is part of the greatest study. That is, to understand the good, we must understand something about the soul itself, that which perceives not only the good, but anything. So Socrates asked Glaucon to imagine a line divided in two, with one segment referring to the intelligible realm, you would say the upper part of the segment, the other to the visible realm. Both segments are then divided in two again. The visible realm consists of both images and artifacts, or things. The intelligible realm consists of mathematical objects and the forms. Now, what does he mean by this? Well, the divided line is meant to illustrate how the perceiving soul relates to the various types of objects that come within our perception. We are, in other words, considering here 4 ways in which the soul can respond to the world, both in regards to perceiving the visible world and understanding the intelligible world. Let's begin with the visible realm, with the lower segment of the line, the segment dealing with images and phantasms. What makes the objects or the objects of perception at this part of the line less real? I think the idea is that, well, an image is an image of something. And while the image itself is real, it's real in a different way than the thing itself. The image is in a relationship of dependence with something. So, for instance, my image in a mirror is certainly real, though it participates in reality in a different way than my body. We could see this even thinking about, examples that wouldn't have been available to Socrates, I suppose. An image, a photograph, right? A photograph of a person is in some ways dependent upon that person, the original. But we understand that it is in a different order of reality. So, here's the question, though. Why is the perception of images in the soul described as a consequence or as something that's possible because of the faculty of imagination? The answer, I think, has something to do with the capacity of the human soul to see an image as an image. That is, the capacity of the human mind to perceive an image as something based upon an original. Now, this occurs in such a way that we're barely conscious of it. We're so familiar with it that it is difficult for us to see that this ability to see images as images is amazing in a way and a source of wonder. So eikesia is the term that Socrates uses for this faculty of seeing images as images. So we turn to the next level of the divided line within the visible realm. This is the realm of objects, things, originals, I suppose, and we're faced with a similar question or a similar problem. So just as in the realm of images, where you have this question of why does Socrates describe the soul's response to images as one of imagination? Here he describes the soul's relationship to perceptible objects as one of trust. The Greek word is pistis. Now, I have a relatively simple answer for this. We just accept that the objects we perceive in the world have a certain degree of stability. We have, in a sense, an attitude of unquestioning trust regarding the various objects that we interact with. Okay, fair enough. Let's return to the question of imagination and eikesia. We can think of eikesia as a kind of imaging capacity, I suppose. That's one way to talk about it. And what we should see is that this is involved not only at the level of discerning that my image in the window is not actually me, or my reflection in the window. This act of imagination, of seeing the way in which different levels of reality are dependent on other or higher levels of reality, is an act that occurs at all levels of thinking. Every level of the line is dependent on the higher. But that's somewhat curious, how are sensible objects images or dependence upon something higher, right? The answer seems to be that objects in the world, anything physical perhaps, have a mathematical structure. So, the shadow of my hand depends upon my hand for its reality, but the sensible world itself is like a shadow, dependent upon some higher form of reality, mathematical forms perhaps. This would be stated later, I think by Galileo, in the following way. The book of nature is written in the character of mathematics. The sensible world is structured by mathematical principles. And those mathematical principles exist in a way that differs from the objects themselves. So, this ascent to the intelligible realm is labeled dianoia by Socrates. Right? Dianoia is essentially the use of thought, including mathematical or quantitative concepts, to investigate or even to just make sense of the world. So to quote Socrates, Those who work in geometry, calculation, and such things suppose or hypothesize the odd and the even, and so on. Assuming these as already known, they make them postulates. They do not deem it worthwhile to give any further account of them, taking them as evident to all. Okay, so how are we to think about this relationship? Well, one way to think about this is just to see that the senses do not in themselves reveal relations. Thought must work through sensory input. And let's use an example that Socrates gives. Consider 3 fingers, your index finger, middle finger, and ring finger. The index finger is smaller than the middle, but larger than the ring. It is both small and large. Our mind discriminates and relates these things, not our senses. Similarly, the simple act of counting the fingers engages the mind. We use pure or invisible units of number to count the always distinct and variable things. So those are some ways to see how dianoia emerges naturally from our encounter with the world, you might say. And we can also think of this in terms of the study of geometry, in terms of what this different level of thinking means. Dianoia thinks of the square itself, right? Geometricians, think of geometers. I'm not sure what they're called, geometricians or geometers. Well, at any rate, whoever they are, let's call them geometers. They think of the square itself while pointing or using the image of the square. So the geometrician might use the drawn square as the image of something that exists in thought, the perfect square. Mathematical properties are in some sense both in the world, but while at the same time having an existence that is out of the world and time. Circles are in the world in a sense, but the perfect circle of geometry is not. There are countable things in the world, but not the invisible units of arithmetic. Now, the mathematical objects have a certainty and a clarity that the objects themselves lack. Our mind comes to understand the visible things in terms of their intelligible foundations, even in the simple act of counting. Again, much of natural science is obviously based upon this understanding, though, of course, not only natural science, even a good degree of common sense. Again, the interesting observation here of Plato, really the fascinating observation, is that the world of matter can be understood mathematically. All reality, visible reality, can be understood, at least in some sense, mathematically. Now, according to Socrates, what we might call the technical application of dianoia, the attempt to use mathematical concepts to understand the disordered jumble of existence, is not able to account for itself. The question is whether thought is able to clarify the presuppositions of dianoia. To do this, the downward path, using thought to understand the world, must be reversed, and thought must attempt to understand the intelligible realm itself. Now, as Glaucon states, this is a difficult task. Socrates observes that the mathematical concepts or objects themselves have a relationship to a higher order of reality. So, this higher order of reality has the same relationship, or has a relationship between itself and the mathematical objects that is similar to the relationship between the mathematical objects and the physical objects, and physical objects and images. So the question is this: what do we gain access to when we gain access to this higher level of reality? What do we gain access to when we're accessing the forms? We can all understand the notion that there are mathematical ideas that relate to the physical world, but are not themselves physical things. But what exactly are the differences between mathematical forms and Platonic ideas? Is there anything beyond images, objects, and mathematical relations? Is there an aspect of reality comprehensible neither by sense perception nor simply by mathematical thinking? And if so, how do we perceive and understand such forms? The problem with understanding this mode of perception is that, in Book 6 of the Republic at least, Socrates does not fully explain it. Rather, he asserts it. Philosophers simply have a perception of forms that transcend ordinary experience while informing it. Philosophers have special insight into the true, the good, the beautiful, the just, and so on. So perhaps our best guidance here is to consider the theory of the forms and the question of insight or noesis, the activity of the soul that is engaged in perception at this level of reality. We should consider these things in light of what Socrates has actually done in the course of investigating the form of justice. Socrates treats the forms in a hypothetical manner, as a spur to thought, as a spur to investigation. The form of justice he treats as an hypothesis because it is simply an implication of language. You might say an implication of common sense, were it not for the fact that common sense never quite investigates this path. You might say, however, that the notion of a form of justice is simply an implication of the way we speak about the political world. And it's this hypothesis of language itself, an opinion, that sets Socrates off on his hunt. Glaucon is led, however, to understand the forms as conclusions, albeit ones he does not fully understand. So, what does it mean to say that the theory of the forms is embedded within ordinary language? Well, this is relatively simple. What will be called Platonism, the notion of there being forms, reality that in some ways supports or undergirds or is in some ways the cause of the multiplicity of different things. Platonism, that's not a fantastic dream of Socrates. It's simply an extrapolation from the way in which we use ordinary language. We apply language, we use terms, common terms, to apply to an almost infinite array of things, thereby expressing what they share. And so Socrates is suggesting, well, maybe there is a reality to those shared ideas. The inquiry into justice itself depends upon an intuitive understanding of meaning. That is, they can't begin having an investigation of what justice is unless they already know in some level what justice is. I know that sounds strange. They begin with a supposition of justice as if it's a kind of harmony between the self and other. But that idea, that's not a conclusion. That's not an eternal form that's somehow perceived by a mystical philosopher. That is a starting point, and clearly one that is rooted in convention and opinion. So Socrates' investigation into justice begins by going down into the city, not by ascending away from the political. Understanding justice requires immersion in the world of human experience and culture, not abstraction from it. And judging by the Republic, it doesn't seem to involve contemplation of the eternal, but rather inquiry into what is human, particularly the human soul. The human soul and the full range of its experiences and desires. So the section on the sun as an image of the idea of the good should be considered in light of the dialogue as a whole. The road to the good begins with ordinary opinion. For Socrates, the questions that emerge in ordinary life, the question about what kind of life we should lead, what kind of life will be conducive to happiness, well, these questions point towards questions about the ultimate nature of reality. I think it is important to note Socrates' frequent references to his own uncertainty in the context of these passages. Just as philosophical investigation leads us to think about the problem of the forms, philosophical questioning about our own notions of what is good, what kind of life we should lead, will lead us to consider whether our notions of the good have any basis in reality at all. We are guided by notions of the good. But are we simply guided by the noble or medicinal lies provided by our society? If so, is there a real good, a genuine good that could provide guidance instead? As in the case of the theory of the forms, Glaucon interprets Socrates' suggestions as if they were conclusions. He interprets philosophy as knowledge of the good, as opposed to pursuit of that knowledge. More next time.